Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. And if I start going too quickly, wave your hands and get me to slow down because I have a lot to cover. And I tried to pick the topics that I'm going to cover because the work that I have done personally and with the Breadfruit Institute and so many collaborators is pretty broad ranging. So I'll get started. So breadfruit is a staple complex carbohydrate crop. I first want to acknowledge and thank my husband, Jim Weissman, who passed away in April 2021. But Jim started doing field work with me when I returned to field work after a 9-year gap in 1996. And he went to all the islands that I went to, and he always had his video camera and his still camera and then a digital camera. And in addition to all the field work that he did in the documentation in the field, he also extensively documented the breadfruit collection at Kahanu Garden. And so I always like to honor and acknowledge Jim for the legacy that he left with breadfruit as well. And to have someone along who really took great pictures. So breadfruit is a Pacific crop. It originated in the Pacific Islands. It grows in a wide range of islands, from high volcanic islands to low atolls to even upraised limestone islands. My talk this morning is going to focus on the Pacific Islands because that is the area of my expertise and work, but there is a very strong Caribbean connection to breadfruit that I'm unfortunately not going to be able to cover today. Maybe that's another talk in the future. But in the Pacific Island, breadfruit is an integral part of the landscape on many islands and in many communities. So you will find trees in yards and in roadsides and in grown in mixed agroforestry systems. And it's a nutritious, easy to grow staple food. It's a long-lived perennial tree. So as a tree, it provides all of the ecosystem benefits that trees provide, whether it's shade, whether it's the biodiversity associated with the tree, whether it's the soil protection and the interaction, and the fact that it's long-lived. Trees will begin producing in a few years after planting and can produce for decades. I've seen 80, 90, 100-year-old trees that are still productive and fruiting. And as I said, it's a complex carbohydrate food. And complex carbohydrates are the staple energy food that humans need. And it's called breadfruit because of the way it was prepared. So when Western voyagers first came to the Pacific Islands and they encountered this fruit, round fruit, oval fruit being roasted on a fire and the fruit hanging on a tree, to them, think about coming on a voyage from England to Guam or Tahiti and the really awful food aboard ship, that hardtack full of weevils, and that to arrive and smell this incredible aroma of bread. It smelled like bread to them. And that's how they coined the name breadfruit. And that's what Ruta is doing. She is roasting breadfruit in the fire in the traditional Tahitian way, and then a close-up of it, and then a woman in Micronesia who's peeling the fruit for a preparation method. So it's called breadfruit, but it has many, many indigenous names, and these are generic names. So I have documented either personally or in the literature 2,300, 2,400 names of breadfruit, but they're generic names. And we put together this poster as an education program because a friend of mine taught with a kapuna, and she went into the 3rd grade at a school. She had all these students from Micronesia and other islands, and they would always go, tutu, tutu, what's the name of breadfruit in our island? So she asked me, and so I got a grant and put this poster together to show the names of the variety of what they call breadfruit. But there's so many other names, and they just don't fit on this map. But you can see the distribution of breadfruit across the Pacific and the names. And in Hawaii, it's ulu. But also this shows you the really knowledge of the indigenous people in ethnotaxonomy, naming names, just like botanists name things using the Linnaean method. And also the migrations. You can track connections and migrations in the Pacific by looking at the names. So I'm going to get into just some of the technical aspects of it and the scientific and botanical. So there are 3 species of breadfruit in the breadfruit complex. There's a wild seeded species called Artocarpus marianensis out in Guam and Mariana Islands in Palau. There's a spiny seeded breadfruit, Artocarpus camansi, native to New Guinea, possibly the Philippines. And then that's this area. And then there's Altilis, which derived. We had always thought it derived from camansi, but we're getting ready to publish a paper showing that the origin may be different, and that Altilis may be its own standalone species that did not originate from camansi. But as Pacific Islanders, so the Pacific was empty. Nobody lived out in the Pacific Islands. No humans lived out in the Pacific Islands, but 5,000-6,000 years ago. And they started over here and worked their way into New Guinea and along the coast and eastward. And then different groups of people moved eastward through Micronesia. And so the story of breadfruit's really interesting to try to connect those migrations and where people came from. But what was interesting is they transformed this very seeded breadfruit, grown for its seeds, which are like chestnuts, over time through horticultural selection and careful observation into a truly seedless breadfruit. And that's also very connected into the cultural uses, and one of those, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, is storage practices. But you have a parallel evolution and development and domestication of breadfruit in Micronesia with this wild seeded breadfruit and probably a seeded breadfruit that came out of this area up into here and then spread east as well. And eventually breadfruit from this area, French Polynesia, was brought up into Hawaii. The breadfruit in the Caribbean, the bread nut, came from one original collection by the French in 1772 from the Philippines, and it was introduced to Mauritius by the French. That was their plant introduction center, and from there was distributed to the French colonies in the Caribbean. And so it preceded seedless breadfruit, and the seedless breadfruit was introduced into the Caribbean by Captain Bligh on his second voyage of the Providence, and about 5 varieties of breadfruit. So the center of origin and diversity for breadfruit, and there are hundreds of varieties, is the primary center of domestication, cultivation, and use. The secondary global center is the Caribbean for 230 years. So why conserve breadfruit diversity? If there are hundreds of varieties in the Pacific, and they're named and they're known and they're appreciated, why is there a need to conserve diversity? Well, there are many reasons, and I think the most profound one was changes, cultural changes, especially after World War II in the Pacific. World War II had an immense impact not only in the European and the Asian theater and world, but in the Pacific Islands. And breadfruit after the war, diets change, economies change, and loss of cultural knowledge, biocultural knowledge, people knowing things about breadfruit, knowing the names, knowing the varieties, knowing how to use it. And there were fewer and fewer varieties and fewer trees. And a similar thing was happening in the Caribbean islands. There was a study done in the 70s where a survey was done, and they documented that estimated there were in the 50s maybe a million breadfruit trees in the region, and it had dropped to fewer than 100,000. So similar thing. And the reason for that was the cultural, but also the environmental. So hurricanes. This was a slide when there were 4 big hurricanes or cyclones out in the Pacific Islands. And of course, we all know what's just recently happened in Jamaica with Hurricane Melissa. And then drought. Drought is a terrible problem. And so the environmental impacts that can kill trees, and then the loss of the biocultural knowledge. And also at an international level, breadfruit is part of this international treaty on plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, and it's on the list as a crop, and a crop of importance that should be conserved. So NTBG, the National Tropical Botanical Garden, was a leader in that. There were collections done in the early 50s and 60s, and breadfruit collections were established in Samoa and Fiji, maybe Tahiti. I tried to find it and never could locate it. And then a couple in Micronesia. And I purposefully went to those islands and visited them to look at those collections. I was able to find all the records on those collections, their provenance records and what was in them. And that one of these collections had 230 accessions, and it was an immense collection. And when I visited in the 1980s, it was abandoned, completely abandoned. So I always knew that, how difficult it could be to maintain a breadfruit collection. And the NTBG in 1976, then when it was the Pacific Tropical Botanical Garden, decided to create as one of the new kind of a focus for this new organization was native Hawaiian plants and breadfruit. And the goal was to create a definitive collection of breadfruit and breadnut. The first collecting expedition funded by PTBG was to collect breadfruit, and 2 of the garden's founding trustees and a botanist, Daryl Herbst, went to Kiribati and collected some varieties. And then another staff member, Steve Perlman, went and collected in Tahiti, and then another associate collected in Samoa, and then colleagues in Pohnpei and the Seychelles planted sent breadfruit varieties. So by 1981, there were 30 varieties planted, 3 trees in the Bride Garden on Kauai, and the rest at Kahanu Garden in Hana, Maui. So this shows the scope of the collecting work. So all the yellow ones are the islands that I visited for my field work from in 85 and 87, and then starting again in 1996 through 2004. So the last collections that I did and brought back materials was 2004, because the ability to collect this kind of plant material became more and more difficult. So when I did my collecting, I had the necessary U.S. Department of Agriculture plant import permits to bring the materials into Hawaii. And I got the only kind of permit I needed from the country of origin is called a phytosanitary permit, which the Department of Agriculture issues. And they basically inspect your materials, make sure they don't have diseases and pests on them. And they have to come in with no soil on them, and I was collecting roots. And then they came into Hawaii and had to go into 1-year post-entry quarantine. But over time, the collecting issues, especially once the Convention of Biological Diversity in 1992, it became more and more difficult to get permits to collect. And then it became extremely difficult to bring plants into the United States and Hawaii. They had to go into a 2-year post-entry quarantine and into a dedicated facility that are very expensive to operate. So that is one reason we haven't quit adding new varieties and materials to the collection, because it just it became almost impossible to do so. So the time I collected, especially in the 80s and the mid-90s, was a real window of opportunity. And in addition to the collecting that I personally did, we had colleagues in other countries, like Solomon Islands, Indonesia, research at New York Botanical Gardens sent materials from Papua New Guinea. So we were able to build the collection that way from materials that colleagues sent to the garden as a repository. And then I'll talk about these documentation projects, the ones that are in blue. So my work, it was involved working with departments of agriculture, and I work with agricultural extension agents because they know the plants and the people and the communities, and they served as my guides and my translators. And I was collecting herbarium vouchers, root material for propagation, and then extensive photographs of the fruit and the leaves, as well as the field notes associated with that. So I work with scores of agricultural agents in the region. And I'm so grateful to all of them for taking me around and answering all my questions. And when I first started, I didn't know anything about breadfruit. So I had lists of breadfruit names, and we had to look at these lists of names together, and we tried to find a tree and collect the information. But the more I collected, obviously, and over time, and once the trees were planted and I was familiar with them, I became more familiar and was able to then have more enriching conversations with the people and the ag agents and the people that I work with. But collecting propagating material, root materials, most breadfruit varieties are seedless, so you have to collect roots. And those roots are bright red because they had to be scrubbed to remove any soil, and then at the time I had to dip them in a fungicide. It's now banned, phenolate, because USDA required that to bring them into Hawaii. Collected the roots, washed them, wrapped them in newspaper, and shipped them back to Hawaii. And I got them back to Hawaii any way I could. So in some countries, depending on my schedule and where I was going next, I would take them to a cargo broker at the airport, and they would ship them. In one island group, I went to the airport because there's a Continental Air Micronesia flight that goes 3 days a week. And so I went to the airport with boxes, labeled boxes that were sealed and labeled and had the USDA plant import permit on it, the bright yellow and green label. And I just started chatting to people in line who were checking in and who were going to Honolulu. And I said, look, will you take this box for me as your checked luggage? I'll give you $25. And this is pre-9/11, right? And so I said, and when you get to Honolulu and you go through customs and immigration, I said, when you get to customs, and leave. Just once you're done, don't ever look and see it. Once you give it to Continental and Pohnpei, walk away, right? It's got the necessary permits, and once it gets to Honolulu and it stays on the carousel and it's the last thing there, someone from USDA will come and pick it up. And so I got several boxes back that way. And then my professor at the University of Hawaii would go down to the airport and to customs, to ag, and pick them up and then bring them back and put them in the greenhouse at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. And so all the plants, I grew all the plants in the greenhouse there. And then once they were large enough, trees, about this size, I loaded them up in a van and they got put on a Young Brothers barge and shipped to Maui. Then I flew to Maui and rented a van and drove them to Hana. So then we have this incredible collection now. So from the 30 trees, it grew to nearly 300 trees, Mike, is that right? Accession trees? No, 300 total because we have about 50 trees in the South Shore Garden. 150 varieties. The trees were planted in rows and grids. And when the director, Dr. Theobald, came over and saw that, he kind of got upset with me because he liked things more naturalistic. And I explained to him, I said, well, I want to collect data on these trees. And so having them in rows and grids is just more helpful. And he's like, okay, he accepted it. And what could he do? There are already trees in the ground. Um, and so these trees and you see the differences in size, and that's a variety difference and or an environmental difference just within that collection. So there are 150 varieties conserved. So how do you make sense of all this diversity? Very little was known about breadfruit diversity. And so we figured out, well, we have to really study and describe this collection. And so photographic documentation was really important. But we did, started in 1996 systematically documenting the collection. And the goal of it for me always was to give back, that it was to conserve these varieties, and that was absolutely critical and foremost. But also to have varieties, make varieties, good quality varieties available for distribution, whether it was repatriating varieties, because many of the varieties in the collection are rare and or now extinct in their home islands. So it's a real honor, but it's also a really awesome, scary responsibility as an organization, because I've seen all these abandoned collections, and for not to happen. So NTBG has done an extraordinary job with maintaining and managing this collection, and Mike Opgenorth, the director, Kahanu Garden, and his staff, and the previous directors there have just been incredible in that job. So what is the value of a breadfruit collection? Well, conservation, but food security, sustainable or regenerative agriculture, crop diversity, traditional knowledge, and climate change impacts. And so some of the key collaborators, because I live on Kauai, so I go to Hana and do field work. I started in 1996 start doing a seasonality project to document when trees produce fruit, because we wanted to see if it was possible to have year-round production. But in 2003, became associated with Dr. Susan Murch, who was at the University of Guelph at the time, and then became, she was a Canada Research Chair at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. So Susan and her graduate students and her team led so much and were involved in so much of the research on the collection. And then Diange Ragone, who's at Northwestern Chicago Botanic Garden, she was the first person to do, after me, to do a PhD on breadfruit, and she did field work, and she went to Papua New Guinea, where I never wanted to go. And so the garden has the only wild collected germplasm from Papua New Guinea in the world that's not in Papua New Guinea, and that was thanks to Diange's field work. But I wanted to show you, the classic academic tree. And so, there I am at the base of the tree. And then there's Susan Murch and the, 6 students who have done master's or PhDs degrees with her on some aspect of breadfruit. And then Nairi, through Northwestern, has had 4 graduate students do master's or PhD, including Elliot Gardner, who was a postdoc here with ICTB and NTBG, and he worked on it. Nairi still is we still collaborate, 25 years later, and we've been working on it for 5 years, and in 2026 we've sworn a blood oath that we are going to get this paper finished and published on a new species name for the hybrid varieties of breadfruit in Micronesia. And then I serve on the affiliate faculty at the University of Hawaii, so I can't chair a committee, but I can be on a committee. So I've served on the committee for 3 students there who did their masters on breadfruit, and then Marin from the University of Copenhagen. So it's so exciting to see all these students who have come out of as they say, I'm their academic grandmother. and so, and then so many other people now around the world getting masters and PhDs studying breadfruit. So research informs curation, conservation, and use of plant genetic resources. So beginning in 1996, the work that has been done, morphological evaluation and descriptors, this isn't just all these photographs. It involved collecting samples and measuring at quantitative and qualitative characters, 56 or 10 leaves, 10 fruit, 10 male flowers, and 10 seeds if they had it, for more than 200 trees. Now, there are still some trees and varieties that need this work done. We did seasonality, which was a 10-year project to every 2 weeks, every month, and then every 2 weeks to monitor what kind of fruits were on the tree at the time. And then Dr. Murch's team and Max Jones did the nutritional composition, which is protein, minerals, provitamin A, carotenoids. We did studies measuring the fruit composition and size, flower production, starch composition quality, micropropagation. I'll talk more about that, which is tissue culture as a way to propagate breadfruit. Insectal properties of male flowers. Ian Cole, who's in the audience and was the collection manager, curator, Kahanu Garden, and did help with research and outreach programs. He was involved working on that project. And then diseases and pests, fruit rot, plant parasitic nematodes, mycorrhizal fungal associations, what's happening with the soil and the trees, and more. And that's the beauty of a collection like this, in addition to conservation, is that you have all these trees in a common garden in a common location, and you can do research. But you can do certain kind of research, and it's kind of research that we did, and there's more that could be done, especially some of the genetic fingerprinting. We cannot and could not do agronomic research. So people would contact me and say, "Oh, I want to establish trees. I want to do this. How do you do X, Y, Z to grow and cultivate and manage a tree?" You need a certain amount of replication. You need to have enough trees of the same variety to do that, because one tree is not representative of that variety. And we couldn't do that because this is as a conservation collection, there are many trees and varieties or accessions that only are represented by one tree. Some of them are duplicated. I think only a few have 3 trees. So we cannot and could not do agronomic research. But fortunately, there's a researcher at the University of Hawaii who was hired a few years ago in the College of Tropical Agriculture, and he has been able to start doing that sort of research, and he's established variety trials. So that's a big body of research that needed to be done and needs to be done, but we could not do because of the nature of the collection. And there's still more research that could be done, and it's just getting people who have the research ideas to do that. And doing the research is, publishing it, make that information available. So, of course, through scientific peer-reviewed articles. And this is a snapshot of some of the journals and publications that we've worked with. I collaborated with an archaeologist on this really cool project to look at a charred fragment she found in a pit in French Polynesia, and she thought it was breadfruit. And I said, well, I think it's probably this breadfruit. We have it at the collection, so I sent her a sample, and she was able to use that sample at the living collections to document and identify this charred sample. That was the first report in the literature of not a charred breadfruit sample. You don't get a lot of pollen because most varieties don't produce pollen. So there's the scientific peer-reviewed articles, and then there are the articles aimed at the home gardener, the farmer, the home cook, the chef. So the first thing we did, starting in 2010, this Ka'ulu, Flourishing, Growing and Flourishing the Breadfruit project. And out of that was a cookbook. Ian was a co-author with me and Craig Elovich on a breadfruit production guide. And then most recently, and with Noelle Dickinson's involvement, the Breadfruit Agroforestry Guide. These are all available, except the cookbook you have to pay for, but they're all available as free PDFs on our website, and also you can buy any of them on Amazon. So those kind of they're technical, but we hope written in a lay general, that an average person who doesn't have a master's or a PhD could read them and understand them. And then, of course, the documentation, the extensive documentation. And the graduate students from from Okanagan, Jim and I, we used to started doing our work in the equipment shed on the floor, and then a research technician who collected and harvested all those fruits and measured them. And then all the incredible students who have come and worked on this project. And so there's Noelle working with one of our students, a graduate student from Chicago, and then Noelle, I think is in that picture. Yeah. In the regenerative forest, doing you can see her, one of our horticultural interns doing a plot. So a big project that we did, and we did it under the mandate, shall I say, of Doug Kenny, who said, you really need to figure out a way to do some value-added stuff on breadfruit. And flour was a project. So breadfruit is perishable. So the limiting factor on greater utilization of breadfruit, one is just knowledge about how to grow it, how to use it, good quality planting material. But then the perishability, how do you deal with that? And so Max Jones, who's now Professor Jones, built this dryer at Kahanu Garden and did some preliminary drying projects. And this was to get samples for the nutritional analysis. But he kind of worked through the whole process. So in 2010, 2015, no one was making breadfruit flour. Breadfruit flour just did not exist at the time. It was not really done in the Pacific Islands. People had done it in the 70s as research projects and a little bit in the early 80s, but it was just this big unknown area. So I'll come back to that. I'm out of order. And then the other kind of documentation and research is then, as a botanical garden, is our herbarium specimens and vouchers and information about subsidiary information about the collection. So the purpose of conserving diversity is to use it. I mean, a lot of scientists, a lot of institutions collect things, and it's almost like it's a trophy. And I've got this, we have this, and I guess it's well and good. It's like having a Picasso, right? I've got this Picasso. But if you're growing a food crop, the purpose of conserving diversity is to use it. Kerry Fowler was the executive director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust. He led the efforts to build that big seed bank in Norway. And so that's what my thinking was always informed by. Don't want to just have this collection. We need to use it. We need to share it. We need to take care of it. And we had to figure out, well, how do we share this collection? And I had over the years provided breadfruit planting material to colleagues. So 30 varieties went to the Caribbean. They went to a researcher at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and did a project in Kiribati and in New Caledonia, where I went and dug up the roots at Kahanu Garden, cleaned them, packaged them, shipped them off. They had, especially in the Pacific, a very small success rate. And we as a garden, and our propagation had a very low success In my field work, I collected in the 96 to 2004 about 100 accessions. There are 3 trees that came out of that successfully and that are in our living collections. And there's the quarantine issues and the possibility of spreading pests and diseases. So I decided, well, there's got to be a different way for us to propagate and distribute breadfruit. And so I had this idea, well, let's just micro-propagate it. And boy, how little I knew. But boy, what a great team took this on. First, a graduate student at the University of Hawaii did her master's, and then Dr. Susan Mersch and her team, and figuring out all the methods. One, how do you get the materials from the tree, get them cleaned up enough so they don't, they're not full of bacteria and fungus, but you don't over clean them so you kill them. And how do you, then once you get them, what kind of nutrients do you give them to grow? What kind of sugar, what kind of hormones, what kind of nutrients? And the goal is you can get one pretty, once you figure out all that, and I say that, like it's easy, but Dr. Merch's team, I think she said they looked at like 500 and some compounds. Now, she's a natural products chemist, so she loves exploring things like that. But, it took us a couple of years to get to the point, and she had the little boxes there, they're called magenta boxes, that had rooted breadfruit. But what you want to do is, you see the one on top is the proliferation. You want to have not just one bud, one plant like this. You want to have, there's a bunch in there. You want to have that. You want to have this proliferation where each of those, you pop that off and that's a little plant. Then you figure out this whole process to get them through these cycles and then put them into a nursery and wean them. And every cycle, every step is different so far for every variety. And some are more difficult at one stage. And but the advantage is, and even though it's very challenging, is here's the traditional way is a root sucker. And this is how Pacific Islanders spread breadfruit throughout the Pacific. This is how British got breadfruit to the Caribbean, and it was spread throughout the Caribbean. But for a lot of reasons, it's impractical. And in some ways, it's going to be permitting is just not going to allow it. And so this was why we went through this process and to figure this out, because I figured if we really wanted to have the ability to do that, we needed to be successful. And I was able to find collaborators and funders who really worked hard at this. And we transformed and we revolutionized the potential for breadfruit globally through this process, in that was able to have micropropagated plants from tissue culture, small rooted plugs, like you could go to the garden shop and buy a flat of petunias or tomatoes, well-rooted plants that could be shipped anywhere in the world, if you can figure out the whole shipping and the permitting issues. But when I first held that first flat of breadfruit plants, and I thought about all those roots, hundreds, thousands of roots that I had dug up and tried to propagate, some successfully or not, and I held that in my hands, it was like, this is the future. This has the potential now to transform everything, because you have a consistent plant. They're uniform and predictable. They're indexed. They're bacteria and virus free. They're vigorous and sometimes precocious fruiting. And so there have been a lot of ups and downs and challenges and figuring out how to do this and what kind of partners to work with. But it is really, that is why there are so many breadfruit trees around the world, is because we are able to do it this way. And through a global hunger initiative, the goal was to distribute good quality varieties for food, reforestation, and economic development, starting in the first micropropagated trees were distributed in 2009, and it's 5 varieties. So this is one of them, the Ma'afala. and it was picked, and it does really well in micropropagation, and it has a really nutritious fruit, and it has, when you dry it, the highest protein content of any variety that we did the nutritional analysis on. And then we work directly or indirectly with many partners. Some of the very first trees went to Haiti with different organizations, Ghana, Jamaica. Mary McLaughlin and her husband Mike with Trees That Feed Foundation are here. There's Mary with one of their early plantings in Jamaica. And you see, we got those plants. So if there's a suitcase full of plugs. So the principal from Germany, our production facility in Germany, it was cheaper for him to fly business class to Ghana and hand carry and check the plants. So he took 800 plants. So by any means possible, hand carried in the overhead or big pallets of plants, get them around. And I really want to acknowledge, and I'm happy they're here in the audience, Trees That Feed Foundation, who approached me, 2008. This is before we were just starting this. This is before we had any plants that could be shipped or distributed. But based in Chicago, and they took this on as their mission to distribute trees, fruit trees, and breadfruit was one of their trees. And their work, go to their website and check it out. Their work has just been phenomenal. So thank you for all the wonderful work that you have done and do to keep this global hunger initiative alive and active and productive. And then just a couple of snapshots of some other projects, because there have been so many, but a young man, Paul Zink, in Costa Rica, got involved, and he started a project called the Jungle Project, and they make flour and chips. And when Patagonia Provisions did their breadfruit cracker, they were able to source the breadfruit flour from him. And so their thing is agroforestry, growing breadfruit in mixed plantings, not commercial forests, not commercial plantations. And so they get the plants, and then they do agroforestry workshops to train the local farmers. And then we had a big project in Africa, a breadfruit project with a woman, Takara Birmingham, who went and did 5, 6, 7 countries and got a lot of trees planted out there. So, and then in Hawaii, we did a really fun, interesting, impactful program called Plant of Tree of Life, Grow Ulu. Because we were doing this international project, and someone came up to me and they said, well, why aren't you distributing plants here in Hawaii? And I went, good question. They said, well, do you need funding? I was like, yeah, okay. And they gave us a grant to distribute trees in Hawaii. And so we distributed more than 10,000 trees, working with 200 organizations throughout the state. We distributed them all the islands, and we did events like at Ma'o Organic Farms on Oahu, where we had a chef come and do a cooking demonstration. We did these fact sheets, and these fact sheets are all on our website, and we gave away trees. And we gave away more than 10,000 trees in Hawaii from 2012 to January 2016. And those trees are now fruiting and flourishing, and allowed the Hawaii Breadfruit Co-op and their members to have fruit and take it to another level. It was such an incredible project. Hawaii has really dire food security issues. I think at that time it was estimated 11% of the population was food insecure, and I think it's now up to 15%. So we focused on areas and communities in Hawaii that have a really high poverty rate, and so distributed the trees. And this is just a collage of a lot of the happy recipients. You can see every single person is smiling. And then we did a totally new project, something we'd never done before because a funder asked us if we would do something like this, and we said sure. And we converted this grove of the Breadfruit Research Orchard, a grove of 25 trees in grass in McBride Garden on Kauai, into a roughly 2-acre biodiverse, multi-story agroforestry planting as a model for the tropics, because the average size farm in the tropics is a hectare, 2.2 acres. And Noelle Dickinson with the Institute has been there since we planted it, and she is the manager of it. And she is monitored with interns and volunteers, or just herself, production and yield of that agroforest for 7 years now, and has a record keeping to show how much production can come out of 2 acres and what could be done, farmers can do around the world. This is shows you the trees just in the grass, and then transforming it in early planting. And then food, the great food. Traditionally, you'll find it in local markets or in people's yards. You know, they sell excess. But man, in the past 10 years, the creativity and the product development is just, every time I go online and Google it, and I find this new product from somewhere in the world, and I'm like so excited. There's so many. If I showed you a slide from a presentation I gave 10 years ago, the few little items, now I could fill a whole presentation with all these items. It's incredible. So whether it's food for your kitchen, you know, or a chef, the diversity and the it's limited only by the creativity. Now I want to go back, since I was out of order, to flour, and why flour, what flour have done, because it was not a traditional thing in the Pacific. There's like one report from maybe 1800s of somebody an island making flour. Breadfruit flour was in the USDA, FDA database as poisonous. And so it flour could not be imported into the United States because of that designation. So Dr. Murch and her team spent months, it was equivalent of a master's thesis, putting together the regulatory request to have breadfruit recognized as generally recognized as safe. It's called GRAS status. And the FDA approved their application. And because of that, now groups in Samoa or Indonesia or Haiti, Puerto Rico maybe is because they're a territory. I forget their designation. Anyway, if you're not a U.S. affiliate, you could not legally bring import breadfruit flour in the United States. And now you can, because of that GRAS status and the work and all that ability for them to do the application came from all the research they were able to do on the collection. So I give Susan and her team just so much thanks and gratitude for this, because now with breadfruit flour, it's a way to process fruit that would otherwise go to waste. And also, it's a way to have a new product and develop new products. So in addition to flour and all the things you can make with flour, some of the products, Mutiny Vodka, we've been able to enjoy it here during the week. There was a 1 or 2 time run of Maui breadfruit beer, liquid breadfruit, but ulu chips. The most recent product is animal crackers made out of ulu flour and Hawaiian honey. So this is just a few of the many products that have come out of this. And that expansion is going to continue. And the creativity in the Caribbean region, oh my gosh, it puts the Pacific Islands to shame in some ways. There's so much entrepreneurship. And then through all of this work, developing outreach and significant outreach. So I helped organize, and we had co-hosted the first international symposium on breadfruit research and development in 2007 in Fiji, and all the papers were published in Acta Horticulturae. But we had 50 participants from 20 plus countries. First time ever to bring together people to talk at breadfruit like this. And a breadfruit conservation strategy came out of that meeting. And then a follow-up in 2015 was at the University of the West Indies with 40 plus countries, 114 participants, some of the same ones at the first one. And then in the Pacific region, there have been summits, almost annual summits throughout Honolulu and throughout the region. And now a new organization or group, the Breadfruit people and Pacific farmers. And so this whole group of people who are working together in different ways to advance the cause of breadfruit in many ways. So I'll wrap up, but out of all of my field work and Jim's video and photography work, we have this just tremendous asset of information. And so the biocultural, the information of traditional methods to prepare and to store breadfruit. My field notes, I have 1,200 pages that have been transcribed and by volunteers, and herbarium vouchers and photographic slides, and then the materials from that aren't available online. They haven't been digitized yet. So it's an incredible resource. So what we've been able to do, and Tiffany just alluded to that, is what a perfect educational training opportunity that we have now. We have a research field station at Kahanu Garden to bring people to Kahanu Garden in Hawaii to train them on how to identify and document and describe breadfruit diversity, because we've done it and we have the documentation. So I was involved with a team of students where we did this work in Samoa and American Samoa, documenting traditional varieties. But then people have reached out to me and asked, can you help us? We want to assess our local varieties. So this team out in Yap, Malaimai, they did this project, and I provided them with guidance on the methodology to use, how to take the photographs, how to put a label in there so you know what it is, and the kind of information to document and describe. And then what they did, in addition to that, they engaged the community, and they not only went, and it started because they wanted to get micropropagated trees. And I said, well, I'm happy that you want to get them, and we'll donate them. But I think it'd be great if you first documented your local varieties to see what you have. And they did. And then they started a garden, a conservation garden of their own varieties, and put together a really nice publication. And then Nairi student Lauren Aldi did a project in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to document the breadfruit there. And similar thing, he used a similar methodology, and she put together a booklet of the local varieties there. And then the most recent one in 2016 was a young man who is from the remote Santa Cruz Islands, the islands I went to but was banned from collecting. They have a purple flesh breadfruit variety. And it's purple. It's not purple when you pick the fruit and cut it. It turns purple after you cook it. So I really wanted that variety for our collection. And so we gave Simon a grant to first go out and document the varieties, which he did. And so the same thing, the variety name and descriptors. I have all of his data, and he and his team interviewed 100 or more people. But the logistic for us to get a permit, A, to collect the variety, and then B, to get it into Hawaii, at this point, I don't like to say insurmountable, but it's close, and there are a lot of reasons. But I do have a dried sample of it because they make a dried breadfruit to preserve it, and it does. There is some purple in there, so it's a real thing. And then most recently, as a resource, is the relaunch of the Breadfruit Variety Catalog database on the Garden's website, www.ntbg.org, or it's a searchable database of about 100 varieties, and it's the variety is not all inclusive of all breadfruit varieties or even of the collection. It's the varieties in the collection for which we have full documentation, and it's evolving because there's more data sets and more varieties and more photographs. And again, thanks to Noelle, because she really led the effort to organize this and working with our IT team. So this now is a resource for people to look at anywhere in the world to hopefully figure out and identify varieties. And with that, I'll say thank you for coming, and enjoyed the breadfruit journey.